So I want to thank Jeff for giving a very nice conceptual overview of the concept of natural capital and its substitutability for physical capital. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the notion of natural capital that we think of when we think of ecosystems. And so if we think about, Jeff described capital as sort of the machinery that runs our economic system. If we think about the machinery in nature, it's like, for instance, this swamp over here, if you will, is a specific area, ecosystem, a part of a biome, and that's the thing, right? That's the stock. But what it does to generate value, in the sense the economists think of it, is it generates a flow of ecosystem services that people value. And I don't have time, when I teach a course, I spend 2 lectures on that, on the graph to the right, which provides sort of a nice taxonomy of all the different types of ecosystem services that are provided and defines them in ways that affect human welfare. So the main point I want to make here is I'm going to be focusing in on what we do to change the economic incentives to improve the provision of ecosystem services. Because if you remove these ecosystems, those services go away. If you change the way those ecosystems are managed, those services are changed, and it changes the economic value. So I'm just going to make a basic proposition which follows rather neatly, I think, from what Jeff said, but maybe more specifically focused on ecosystem services. And I'll assert that markets actually work extremely well to determine how ecosystems are managed today. So the markets, though, tend to favor traditional commodities like agricultural commodities, timber, and what for. So we shouldn't be surprised to see ecosystems managed for these commodities where there's a price in the market. But there's folks like Ed Barbier, others in the audience as well, have done some very nice work showing us that a lot of these natural ecosystems, say like mangroves, in Ed's case, have extremely high values that may very well be higher than the traditional commodity values that are produced by these ecosystems, yet they have no markets. So once again, we should not be surprised that these ecosystems aren't managed as much for these non-market ecosystem services as they are for the ecosystem services. And so how do you correct this problem? We get the prices right. I'm the 51st person to say that, right? So what I'm going to talk about in the 12 minutes or so that I have left is efforts within the United States to, in essence, align the notion of ecosystem services with economic incentives, both sort of at a conceptual level and then on the ground. So I want to think of the world in 2 dimensions, from top down to bottom up. And if we think about efforts, again, I'm focusing primarily on efforts in the United States, so those are the examples I'm going to use. We'll start at a very top-down level, and the notion of computing green GDP. So the GDP that we use, the gross domestic product measures that we use right now, do not adequately account for the destruction of natural resources and environmental capital in the production of the goods and services that we consume. So there have been efforts that have stemmed at least as far back as Nordhaus and Tobin in the 1970s to try to make adjustments to have a more accurate and comprehensive measure of GDP that takes these factors into consideration. Those efforts have not gone very far in the policy process. They've gone farther in academia than they have in the policy process. But in the 1990s in the US, there was sort of like a case study that was done to look at the contribution of the mining sector to GDP with and without these measures. I'll just say that was not a politically popular study in certain parts of the United States, and these types of studies were not commissioned too much further, and the whole notion of calculating an alternative green GDP has sort of gone by the wayside. However, from the top-down perspective, there are other efforts. I don't know how well you can see this, but the White House released a report essentially saying that federal lands in the United States should be managed under the principles of ecosystem services. In other words, taking into consideration the values of ecosystem services should be one of the considerations for how we manage our lands. Now, That's an easier thing to say than it is to do, and my colleagues at Duke, led by Lydia Olander, have put together a working group across agencies in the U.S. that are looking at sort of practical methods to implement ecosystem services on federal land decisions. That's all I'm going to say about that right now, but I think it's a fairly interesting process. As we move further down from top down to bottom up, we look at public payments for ecosystem services. And so in the U.S., and I make a distinction between public, because then I'm going to move to sort of more bottom-up notions in just a moment. The best examples we have in the United States are the federal government paying for ecosystem services through programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, which has been around longer than the term ecosystem services has been, so it wasn't set up to be an ecosystem services payment scheme, but effectively operates that way. In that land, and it's a fairly large-scale program, it operates at about 30 million acres in the United States, and so farmers actually bid to participate in the Conservation Reserve Program. Its initial objectives, when it was set up actually as far back as the 1950s, was sort of soil conservation, but it has moved on to a much more heterodox definition of ecosystem services, and the willingness of the government to accept a bid from the farmers depends on a measure that captures ecosystem services and environmental benefits index. So that's a fairly good-sized program. There's other programs like the Wetlands Reserve Program, which has been absorbed very recently in the last couple of months into a broader scheme of agricultural conservation easement programs that are sort of follow the same scheme where the government pays private landowners for the provision of ecosystem services. And then if we think about moving actually all the way down to the bottom of the list, to the bottom-up notion is a Coasean transaction. So the sort of general notion of decentralized parties acting in their own self-interest transact in order to exchange money to pay for ecosystem services. And I'm going to talk about that next, and then I'm going to move to the notion of ecosystem service markets. That was too fast. Okay, let me see. Too much coffee or not enough? So Coasean Solution 1. Very prominent in the U.S. and other parts of the world as well, is the notion of conservation land trust. So I donate money to the Nature Conservancy, to the Triangle Land Conservancy, which is the area around Durham, North Carolina, that is used by a private NGO to pay private landowners for either an outright purchase of their land or for easements on their land so that they don't convert it to a shopping mall. These have protected, hundreds of millions of acres, actually throughout the world, and it's a classic Coasean solution in that it's really not a government regulation that's driving this, but self-interested parties to do that. There's a really interesting case. There was a rather prominent case in the U.S. a few weeks ago where a rancher, I believe it was in New Mexico, basically met federal agents with weaponry and said, "You're not taking away my damn grazing rights," and a big conflagration ensued. Well, there have been other cases where ranchers have essentially sold their ranching rights to NGOs or other private parties as a sort of Coasean transaction to, that's stop short of violence and sort of a win-win outcome for both parties. Another example of a Coasean solution happens south of the border prominently, and these are the emergence of water funds in Latin America. It's sort of a form of a payment for ecosystem services or watershed services. It's become more common in places like Ecuador, Colombia, and Bolivia. When I say more common, there's still only about 10. But they're important because what they do is they establish a central fund up front. And so this is like a financing mechanism as well. Establishes a bunch of money up front in a trust fund, and it's the dividends from that trust fund that are used then to pay farmers upstream to change their practices to keep water clean, say in Quito, Ecuador. And the reason I call this the Coasean transaction is driven actually in large part by contributions from the local water utility as well as a brewery. And we all know that that's an important social good. And so we think that these types of things should be encouraged. And so these are examples of Coasean solutions. But I want to spend most of the rest of my 5 minutes talking about ecosystem service markets in sort of a more conventional way. And so this is when we think about markets, we want to talk in demand and supply. And so let's think about a market for ecosystem service where the demand is driven by either an individual or a firm's willingness to pay for the ecosystem service. What drives that demand is either pure altruism, which is not unlike the Coase solutions that we talked about, as well as pure self-interest. But also the interesting case here is the notion of government regulation with some flexible means of compliance. So you might actually be able to pay a party to do something that they weren't obligated to do in order for you to meet your compliance obligation. The supply side of this is really met by what is the marginal cost associated with the types of actions like changing your farming practices in order to reduce nitrogen loadings. What is the cost of that, and how much do you, as a farmer, for instance, would need to receive from the market in order to actively and voluntarily engage in that agreement? So when we think about markets, we usually think about lots of sellers and buyers. That would be the ideal, where there's thousands maybe of buyers and sellers in a market like this, and credits and these offsets are traded in an exchange. We're not really there yet. Okay, there are examples in the U.S. Where this is happening on the ground and have for decades in some cases. One is the area of wetlands mitigation. President H.W. Bush, back in 1990 declared no net loss of wetlands, and so one of the ways that no net loss of wetlands is accomplished in the United States is through the trading of wetlands mitigation. So you can clear a wetland if you're a developer, but you have to pay somebody else through a wetland bank or directly to either protect or, in more cases, to actually create a wetland. Now that creates some ecological problems that I don't have time to get into, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. And then there's water quality trading of the type that I sort of alluded to earlier with farmers, where a farmer maybe will change their agricultural practices to reduce less nitrogen, to introduce less nitrogen into a waterway, and that might be paid for by a sewage treatment plant that is subject to EPA regulations for water quality for direct discharges into the environment. And then habitat conservation banking, you can comply with the Endangered Species Act in the United States if you participate in a conservation bank where habitat is created by a third party to offset the losses that might occur. Now the big kahuna in all of this is forest carbon markets because it's tied to the climate mitigation. It's tied to the international and domestic schemes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from climate change. Examples in the U.S. are that the forest carbon offsets are allowed in the California compliance market, driven by the AB 32 rule that we've talked about here. Entities can meet up to 8% of their compliance obligations under the cap and trade program there with offsets, and the largest single category of offsets is forest carbon offsets. So this has been an incentive for the protection and enhancement of forest ecosystems in the U.S. Internationally, and I work on these areas quite extensively through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have, and Jeff alluded to it briefly, we have these broad international schemes such as RED+, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, where developing countries are paid to reduce their rates of deforestation and carbon loss from those forests. If I had time, I'd talk a little bit more about blue carbon, which sort of translates this concept to marine and coastal ecosystems. HYPE. So the Katuma Group is an organization that is aligned with Ecosystem Marketplace, and they do a study every couple of years on the state of the ecosystem service markets. And essentially what this table says is, they've been doing this since 2006. In 2006, there was an expectation that by 2020, the forest carbon offsets for the compliance market might be $5 to $8 billion per year. The actual market size in 2012 is $26 million. Now that's before the California market, but the California market doesn't make it that much larger. Now the revised expectation for what it will be by 2020 is $470 million, so an order of magnitude smaller. If we go through each of these categories, what we will find is that the expectations for these ecosystem service markets have not lived up to the expectations that have been established. Why is that the case? One is that there's been a lack of regulation to drive demand of the type that I talked about. So those expectations of a $5 to $8 billion forest carbon market were based on the expectation of an international climate regime that accept those forest carbon credits as part of the compliance mechanism. That has not occurred. There are low prices where the demand does exist for these offsets, and that has kept supply low. The transactions cost can be extremely high. I was intrigued by Matt Turner's discussion today about how big data might actually be able to bring these transaction costs down. And there's essentially been skepticism which has kept this market from expanding further, both in terms of the severity of environmental problems, that is back to the lack of regulation to drive demand, and in some places it's a lack of faith and even an antipathy towards the use of markets to solve these problems. So two big ideas I'm going to end with because I am out of time. One is, so back in the States, big idea one is, are we really going to get serious about water pollution from agriculture? If you look in the upper part of the chart, oh, there we go. This is indexes of water quality in the United States for the last several decades, and we see that we've had improvements, up is good, down is bad. We've had improvements in stabilization of water quality in our rivers and lakes, but we've had a steady decline in estuaries. This is a picture of the hypoxia problem in the Gulf of Mexico. It is driven entirely by, almost entirely by the role of agriculture in the Mississippi River Valley. Interestingly, there's about 100 counties or so that contribute about half of the nitrogen to the hypoxia problem. We need to get serious about that problem, and I think market-based mechanisms can be a way to make that happen. The next thing is, I just leave with sort of a big picture concept, tying it back to yesterday's discussion. What does agriculture look like in a green economy? Our natural ecosystem, the destructions that I've talked about here and that happen throughout the world are all driven almost entirely by agricultural production, including biofuels production most recently. So if we want to solve these problems, we have to wrestle with agriculture. And so I ask you, what is greener? Is it the sort of low impact land extensive farming that takes a lot of land, or is it the more intensive agricultural farming that we're used to that generates nitrogen and phosphorus? More land or more intensive on some land? That's a debate that's ongoing. There's been a lot of emphasis on raising productivity as a way to save land and to reduce environmental impacts. I'll say that some of the work that I've done shows that you can get sort of perverse outcomes from that. For instance, raising the productivity of crops makes them cheaper, which means that the livestock herd expands. Livestock creates methane emissions, so we have like a feedback effect. And then what do we envision the future of agriculture to be? And not 10 years down the road, but 50 years down the road. I mean, we're going to have 9 billion mouths to feed, all of whom are going to have more sort of wealthy lifestyles and bigger diets. So are we just going to radically change the way that we grow food? I mean, vertical farming already occurs in some places, like in China, where you actually go by a building and you look at it, and it's a 12-story building, and there's livestock in that building, and they're being raised for food consumption. GMOs is a big issue. I just put that there as a bullet. And then are we going to have major dietary shifts that are going to change the way that we produce and consume agriculture? So that's the final big idea I leave you with. So thanks.